A lone rider gallops through the night, his horse exhausted, but he does not stop. A fresh mount waits at the next relay station. This is the Yam, the Mongol communication network stretching from Hungary to Korea, binding the largest contiguous land empire in history. Without it, the empire would have fragmented within weeks. Every hour of delay meant lost control. Riders could cover 200 miles a day, faster than any other system in the medieval world, including the Roman cursus publicus. In days, not weeks, a message could cross an entire continent. How did the Mongols build and maintain such a network across deserts, mountains, and open steppe? The answer begins with the stations themselves. Every 20 to 30 miles, sometimes closer in difficult terrain, a relay station stood ready. Each one held a stable of fresh horses, barrels of fodder, food supplies for riders, and often a small garrison. The logic was brutally simple. A messenger could ride at full gallop, push his horse to its limit, and then swap for a fresh mount without losing a step. Sometimes he passed the message itself to a new rider in a choreographed handoff. The horse never stopped long enough to cool down. The rider never waited for an animal to recover. This relentless relay made possible speeds that seemed impossible for the medieval world. While the Roman cursus publicus, the most famous predecessor, could manage perhaps 100 miles on a good day, a Yam rider on urgent business could cover 200 to 250 miles in the same 24 hours. The difference was not just in horses or roads, but in the entire philosophy of movement. The Romans built straight stone roads and used a single horse for long stretches. The Mongols built a system designed for maximum velocity over any terrain, trading endurance for raw speed at every station. That speed translated directly into control. A rebellion in Persia could be known in the imperial capital within a week. Orders to mobilize troops could reach commanders on the far side of the empire faster than the rebels could coordinate. The Yam did not just send letters, it compressed the time between event and response, giving the Khan a grip on his domain that no other ruler could match. And all of it rested on nothing more than carefully spaced posts, fresh horses, and riders who understood that a minute saved could mean the difference between an empire intact and an empire in flames. But raw speed meant nothing if anyone could jump on a horse and ride the relay. The Yam needed control as much as velocity, and control came in the form of a small object called the paser. A paser was a tablet, usually made of metal or sometimes carved wood, inscribed with the Khan's authority. It was carried by messengers, officials, and envoys, and it determined exactly what they could demand. There were 3 tiers. The gold paser, reserved for the highest-ranked emissaries, entitled its bearer to fresh horses, food, shelter, and priority passage at any station. The silver paser provided similar access but at a slightly lower level. The bronze paser, the most common, gave a rider what he needed to complete his journey, but nothing beyond that. This system did more than ration resources. It made the Yam a closed network. No one could simply wander up to a relay station and claim a horse. The tablet was proof of imperial purpose. Station masters inspected the inscription, matched it to their registers, and supplied only what the tier allowed. If a messenger tried to push for more than his tablet granted, he could be denied, reported, or worse. Counterfeiting a paser was an offense that carried penalties of extreme severity. The Khan knew that a forged pass could let an enemy agent slip through the network, spread false orders, or drain resources. So the inscriptions were specific. They named the bearer, his rank, his route, and the authority behind him. Faking that was not just fraud, it was treason. In this way, the Pesa turned the Yam from a simple postal system into a finely calibrated instrument of imperial control. The Khan did not just own the horses and stations. He owned the right to move through them, and that meant every message that traveled the relay carried at its heart the Khan's own permission. The Pesa gave a rider the right to move, but without the stations that right meant nothing. Tens of thousands of people across the empire kept those stations running. A typical relay employed a station master called a jamachi, who managed the whole operation. Under him worked grooms, horse herders, farriers, guards, and laborers who hauled water, foraged for fodder, and repaired buildings. Their main job was brutal in its simplicity. Keep a constant supply of fresh, rested horses ready at all times, day or night, in any weather. A rider could arrive exhausted at any hour. Within minutes, a groom had to produce a saddled horse while another led the spent animal to water and feed. For this, workers received exemptions from taxes and military service. That was a real privilege, but the trade-off was a life of endless demand. In the Gobi Desert, stations were 80 miles apart because the terrain was so punishing. Workers hauled water from distant wells and stored grain against winter. In the mountains, they cleared snow from the path and risked avalanches. They lived in cramped mud brick or felt shelters far from any settlement. Isolation wore them down and the workload never stopped. The Yam operated around the clock every day of the year. A station master could be roused 3 times in a single night to log a messenger's arrival, inspect his Pesa, and authorize the next horse. These people were the unseen engine of the empire, but the system that relied on them also exhausted them. The exemptions bound workers to the station permanently. There was no promotion, no rotation. If a station failed, punishment fell on the master and his crew. Failure was common when horses perished, fodder ran out, or bandits raided supplies. The human foundation of the Yam was strong, but it was built of people who had little choice, and that tension only grew as the empire expanded. The Gobi's 80-mile gaps were extreme. The Yam stretched through the Taklamakan Desert, where summer heat could kill a horse before it finished a stage. To cross those sand seas, the Mongols placed stone-lined cisterns at intervals, filled by caravans that hauled water from the nearest river. Grain depots were stocked with barley and dried meat, enough to last a station through a season. In the most barren stretches, extra camels stood ready not for riding, but to carry water skins for the next leg. Without these caches, the desert would have swallowed the system. Higher up, the problems changed. In the Altai Mountains, horses weakened above 10,000 feet. Yaks, which thrive on thin air and snow, replaced ponies at the highest relay points. Some accounts mention reindeer used in the Siberian taiga, animals that could pour through ice for moss. The Mongols were not sentimental about tradition. If an animal moved faster through a given terrain, they requisitioned it. Riders learned to wrap their faces in felt to survive blizzards and to sleep in snow shelters when a station was hours away. Seasonal shifts forced constant rerouting. Winter in Siberia blocked passes under drifts so deep that no horse could break through. The Yam mapped alternative paths that followed river valleys where the wind was less fierce and fuel more abundant. Stations in these valleys stored enough dried dung and timber to last 4 months of isolation. Messengers carried extra rations and spare felt blankets. A route that worked in July might be impassable in January, and the empire could not afford to lose contact for half a year. The solutions were ingenious, but each multiplied the cost. Every cistern needed a guardian, every depot needed guards against bandits and freezing. A single failed supply caravan could doom an entire route for a season. The Yam's reach was extraordinary, yet its grip depended on hundreds of vulnerable outposts strung across the harshest landscapes on Earth. And as the Mongol borders pushed further into China, Persia, and Russia, the distances between those outposts only grew. The geography that made the Yam impressive also made it brittle, a tension that would become more dangerous with time. The Yam's ability to cross deserts and mountains was remarkable, but speed alone never held an empire together. Messages traveled fast, yet what filled those messages mattered even more. The Mongol Khans understood something that many rulers before them had missed. The same network that carried orders could also carry information back. Every rider, every station master became an observer by design. A messenger did not simply gallop past a village without noticing whether it was quiet, prosperous, or smoldering with unrest. Riders were trained to report anything unusual, crops failing, travelers gathering in unusual numbers, a local official demanding more grain than usual. A village that suddenly produced fewer horses needed explanation. A road that seemed emptier than expected could mean bandits. These observations traveled with the dispatches, passed from station to station, until they reached a governor or the Khan himself. Station masters played an even more deliberate role. Their position placed them at the intersection of local life and imperial authority. Travelers stopped, exchanged news, rested. A station master heard rumors from merchants, complaints from conscripts, boasts from soldiers. He knew which herds were thinning, which officials were resented, which families had lost sons to a distant campaign. That information was not idle gossip, it was currency. A station master who reported a brewing rebellion before arrows flew could save a province. One who stayed silent risked his own life. The system extended even further with official travelers. Envoys and inspectors rode the Yam with orders to observe as much as to deliver. They noted the condition of roads, the mood of local populations, the competence of stationed officials. Their reports crossed with the routine dispatches, creating a picture that no single observer could distort. But perhaps the most revealing use of the network was internal. Mongol Khans used the Yam to watch their own governors and generals. A provincial commander who raised an army without authorization, who stockpiled grain, who received unusual visitors, the Khan would know within days. Speed of information gave the center an advantage over the periphery, one that kept ambitious men from acting on their ambitions. The Yam was not merely a post road. It was the empire's circulatory system, and the blood it carried was intelligence. Every message was a report, every messenger a spy by default. The line between communication and surveillance had dissolved, and the subject did not always know which side he stood on. But the Mongols also deployed agents who moved through the Yam under deliberate cover. Merchants, pilgrims, wandering monks, even traveling entertainers could be gathering intelligence. A Persian trader who had visited Baghdad might describe its defenses to a Mongol officer over a meal at a relay station. The Mongols formalized this shadow network through a bureau known as the Yargu, which coordinated espionage across the empire. The Yargu dispatched agents with specific targets. These operatives carried paisa granting them access to the Yam, but they often traveled without obvious credentials. A man calling himself a Buddhist monk might ride from station to station, stopping to pray, while actually assessing the loyalty of a regional governor. The Yam gave him speed and cover. He was just another face on the road. The most effective spies were recruited from conquered populations. A Persian administrator who knew Islamic politics, a Chinese scholar familiar with Song court intrigues, a Turkic mercenary who had fought for both sides, all could be turned into assets. Local knowledge was irreplaceable. A spy who spoke the language and understood the customs could gather intelligence no outsider could. The Yam allowed the Mongols to deploy these agents quickly and rotate them before they were compromised. The targets went beyond military rivals. Spies monitored economic conditions, tracking grain prices, herd movements, and trade volumes. A sudden rise in grain prices could indicate hoarding by a governor preparing for rebellion. A drop in horse sales along a frontier might mean a neighboring kingdom was arming. The Yam delivered this data fast, allowing the imperial center to react before a crisis escalated. But this pervasive surveillance came with a cost. The same speed that allowed the Khan to trust his governors also allowed him to suspect them. Paranoia traveled the Yam as quickly as dispatches. A report that a general had hosted unusual visitors could lead to an investigation or dismissal. The network that held the empire together fed a cycle of suspicion, and the agents who rode the Yam were never certain whether they themselves were being watched. Every fresh report added to the burden of control. On campaign, the relay stations became arteries of command, pumping orders from the center to armies spread across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. The Mongol conquests were rarely single-army affairs. When Subutai invaded Eastern Europe in 1241, he commanded multiple columns advancing simultaneously through Poland, Hungary, and Transylvania. The Yam kept these columns synchronized. A courier could ride from Subutai's headquarters to a distant detachment in days, carrying orders to change course, wait for reinforcements, or engage the enemy at a specific time. Without that speed, the columns would have drifted apart, and the enemy could have defeated them in detail. The invasion of the Rus principalities between 1237 and 1240 demanded coordination across frozen rivers, endless forests, and fortified cities spread over 1,000 miles. Messengers shuttled between the main army and siege forces, delivering reconnaissance reports on river crossings, winter conditions, and the movements of rival princes. When the Mongols besieged Baghdad in 1258, armies approached from several directions, each line of advance requiring constant updates. The Yam allowed Yargu to manage this convergence with precision, adjusting timetables as defenders destroyed bridges or flooded the countryside. The couriers who rode into battle zones carried more than dispatches. They carried maps sketched on leather, siege plans drawn in charcoal, and intelligence reports from spies who had infiltrated the target city days earlier. The horses at relay stations near the front were often battle-trained, accustomed to the noise and chaos of war. A messenger arriving with a fresh mount could push through to the front line without hesitation. Behind every successful campaign was a network of riders who turned the Khan's will into action faster than any enemy could respond. That speed of command was the Mongols' most consistent advantage. But that speed came at a staggering price. The Yam was an engine of extraction that reached into every community along its routes. Towns and villages were forced to supply a fixed quota of horses, fodder, food, and labor, often at a moment's notice. The cost was passed down as a special tax, separate from the regular tribute, and in many regions it could consume a quarter of a household's income. The burden was not only financial. Men were conscripted as grooms, station keepers, and herders, pulled from their fields and families for months at a time. The system touched nearly every community, and its demands were relentless. The system also invited exploitation. Travelers carrying a high-status paisa could demand far more than regulations allowed. A single envoy might force a station to provide an extra dozen horses for his retinue, depleting resources meant for the next rider. Station masters, desperate to meet quotas, sometimes seized livestock from nearby farms without compensation. During a campaign in Korea in 1259, Mongol envoys requisitioned cattle from entire villages to feed their horses, leaving farmers without plow animals for the coming spring. Such exploitation was not exceptional but routine. This fueled resentment and open revolt. In Korea, repeated uprisings against Mongol rule were partly sparked by the crushing demands of the relay network. The Goryeo court, already a vassal state, found itself unable to protect its own farmers from the system's demands. In China, under the Yuan Dynasty, the burden fell hardest on the peasantry, who saw their surpluses consumed by a network that served the distant Khan. Rebellions in southern China during the 1280s were fueled by anger over forced contributions to the yam. For peasants, the yam was a constant drain, taking not only surpluses but the means to produce them. Mongol rulers were not blind to these problems. Kublai Khan issued decrees limiting the number of horses a traveler could demand and ordering officials to compensate villages fairly. But enforcement was weak. The system was inherently extractive, depending on local communities to subsidize imperial communication. Every attempt to tighten regulation only added more layers of bureaucracy, which created new opportunities for corruption. The very speed and reach that made the yam so effective also made it impossible to control. The empire's greatest tool of coordination was simultaneously a machine for generating resistance. The Roman cursus publicus, the Byzantine dromos, and the Islamic Barid each solved the same fundamental problem of moving information across vast territory, but with very different trade-offs. The Romans built stations every 10 to 15 miles along stone roads. Under Augustus, a messenger could cover 50 miles in a day, perhaps 100 at peak. That was half what the yam achieved routinely. The cursus publicus had no built-in intelligence function. Information moved but did not flow upward as surveillance, and a broken bridge or flooded pass could halt a message for days. The Byzantine dromos was more militarized with a dense network of relay stations and military couriers, but it was chronically underfunded and vulnerable to corruption. Station masters often extorted travelers, much like later abuses on the yam. Yet its critical weakness was centralization in Constantinople. Provincial governors had to request permission before using the system, creating bottlenecks during emergencies. The Islamic Barid, established under the Umayyads and refined by the Abbasids, came closest to the Mongol model. It combined the postal relay with a formal intelligence bureau. Riders reported on local conditions and officials, allowing caliphs to monitor governors across North Africa and Persia. Its speed reached about 150 miles per day on good routes. But the Barid was expensive, and its reach shrank as the caliphate fragmented. By the 10th century, many stations had fallen into disrepair. What set the yam apart was not just raw speed. It was integration with nomadic culture. The Mongols did not need to carve roads across the steppe. They used the landscape itself. Their horses were bred for endurance over rough terrain, and the relay principle was simply the old Mongol gur, the system of shifting mounts during a hunt scaled to an empire. Intelligence was woven into every rider's duty. The result was a communication network that simultaneously functioned as a surveillance network, a military courier service, and a logistics backbone, all without rigid dependence on permanent roads or centralized command. That comparison changes how we see the cost of the yam. The burdens on local communities were real, but they brought an unprecedented level of imperial awareness and responsiveness. No other medieval ruler could know what was happening at the edge of his domain within days. No other system could coordinate armies across continents. The Mongol yam was built for a purpose earlier empires had only partially understood: information as an instrument of control. When the Mongols conquered China and established the Yuan dynasty, the yam entered a new phase. The network that had been forged on the steppe, flexible and intelligence-driven, now had to serve a settled empire with centuries of its own bureaucratic tradition. The Yuan emperors expanded the station network dramatically, especially inside China proper. By the late 13th century, there were over 1,000 stations across the empire, more than ever before. But expansion came with a cost. Chinese officials were brought in to manage logistics, and they brought assumptions that had governed imperial communication since the Han Dynasty. Standards were codified in legal codes: the number of horses per station, the rations for riders, the frequency of patrols, all became matters of regulation rather than local adaptation. The Yam was transformed from a living, improvisational system into a fixed administrative machine, and its priorities changed. Under the early Mongol Khans, the Yam's primary function was military intelligence and rapid response to threats. In Yuan China, it increasingly became a conduit for tax collection, grain shipments, and routine administrative correspondence. The flow of information shifted from intelligence reports from the frontier to bureaucratic paperwork between provincial capitals. The spies on horseback and the riders who reported on rebellions were still there, but they were being crowded out by accountants and clerks. This tension between Mongol traditions and Chinese governance ran through the entire Yuan period. The Mongols knew that the Yam had made their conquest possible, yet they were gradually handing control of it to the very administrators whose style of rule they had once overthrown. The flexibility that made the system so effective became constrained by rules written in Chinese and enforced by Confucian-trained functionaries. The Yam was still the fastest communication network in the world. But it was no longer the same instrument of control that had once allowed a handful of nomads to hold half the world in their grip. That change would create vulnerabilities that the empire could not afford. The bureaucratization of the Yam under the Yuan was not, in itself, fatal. A slower, more regulated system could still function, but the empire was about to face stresses that no amount of paperwork could solve. By the early 14th century, the Mongol Empire had fractured into competing khanates, and civil wars tore through the networks they had once shared. Routes that connected the steppe from Crimea to Korea now crossed hostile borders. Stations that had been part of a unified relay were abandoned, destroyed in raids, or repurposed by rival khans. The Yam required an unbroken chain, and that chain was breaking. Overuse compounded the damage. Horses were exhausted, station buildings crumbled, local communities, drained by decades of imperial taxation, could no longer meet quotas. Repairs became rare. Many stations barely functioned, staffed by a few exhausted grooms and half-starved ponies. Corruption finished what war and neglect had started. Local officials turned Yam resources into private profit, charging illegal fees, renting out horses to merchants, and selling grain supplies meant for station personnel. The Pesa system, once a tight control on access, was abused. Counterfeit passes circulated. The distinction between authorized messengers and parasitic travelers blurred. Then came the Black Death. The pandemic swept through Eurasia in the mid-14th century, severely reducing the labor force that fed, watered, and saddled the horses. Entire station communities vanished. The empire could no longer afford the Yam, yet could not function without it. This created a vicious circle. Without fast communication, the empire could not respond to rebellions or invasions. Without security, the routes became more dangerous and expensive to maintain. The system that had once held the Mongol world together now accelerated its unraveling. But even as the Yam collapsed in the Mongol world, its structure survived in a distant empire that had once been conquered by the Mongols, Russia. The Russian word for a postal station is Yam, and the system itself was called the Yamskaya Gonba, or simply the Yam. It operated on the exact same relay principle. Stations spaced roughly 20 to 30 miles apart, fresh horses and grooms ready at a moment's notice. This network persisted well into the 19th century, long after the Mongol Khans were gone. The Russian Empire, stretching from the Baltic to the Pacific, faced the same problem of distance. And it borrowed the solution wholesale. The influence reached beyond Russia. European travelers like Marco Polo returned from the Mongol court with accounts of riders covering unimaginable distances in days. Those stories circulated among merchants, scholars, and rulers. They planted the idea that an empire could be held together not just by roads, but by organized relays of speed. Centuries later, when the British mail coach system was refined, and when the American Pony Express briefly tried to cross the continent in 10 days, the underlying logic was the same. Change horses, keep moving, hand off the message. The Yam's blueprint proved adaptable, so the legacy of the Mongol communication network isn't a museum piece. It's the principle that efficient long-distance communication depends not on the fastest single rider, but on a coordinated chain. Every time a package moves through a sorting hub or a parcel is transferred between trucks, the ghost of the Yam is there. The Mongol Empire itself crumbled, but its solution to the tyranny of distance outlasted it, passed down through languages, empires, and centuries, until it became part of how the modern world moves information. The Mongol Yam was a system of horses and routes, but also of human bodies. Riders pushed past exhaustion, froze in mountain passes, and sometimes never returned. Chinese officials complained it drained villages of their strongest young men. Legal records document riders suffering severe frostbite, thrown on treacherous paths, or attacked by bandits and wolves. The empire demanded speed, and speed demanded sacrifice. These ordinary people, farmers conscripted into service, herders who knew the land, couriers who memorized routes through endless grassland, were the backbone of Mongol control. Their loyalty was not to any ideology but to the simple duty of moving a message forward. Yet history rarely records their names. Their stories survive only as a line in a traveler's journal or a complaint in an official's report. They carried the empire on their backs, and when it fell, they were forgotten. But the system they enabled had already proven its power. The section is deleted per macro edit instruction. No output. The macro edit instruction deletes this entire section. No output is produced. From the first relay station to the modern server farm, one truth holds for every empire that tried to hold itself together across distance. Control is not just about armies. It is about the ability to transmit information faster than your rivals. The Yam gave the Mongols a decisive edge because it turned communication into an advantage. Every message was a command, every report a threat neutralized, every hour saved a chance to act before the enemy even knew the game had started. Empires that mastered the flow of intelligence survived. Those that did not fractured. In the end, the race to conquer distance and time is a race for power itself. That lesson is no less true for the internet than it was for the steppe. So here is a question worth sitting on. If you were a medieval ruler, would you invest more in a larger army or a faster communication system? Why? Subscribing brings you deeper into the hidden mechanisms of history, the logistics, the untold stories, and the systems that shaped empires. New videos every week explore what actually made the past work.